Servers of Reddit, what's the most awkward date you've seen unfold? Date I witnessed. Guy pulls out chair for girl. She doesn't realize what he is doing. Awkward pause. Sits down. Guy clears throat and starts coughing because he cleared it too hard or something. She doesn't know what to do. Ignores him, picks up the menu. Waiter comes, she asks her date if he knows what's good. He says he'll have what she is having. Hands menu to waiter. She orders seafood. Awkward pause. He is allergic to seafood, takes the menu back and looks for another minute. Waiter says he can come back. He says no, he'll have a steak. Waiter leaves. They sit staring. Not quietly looking around or at their phones. Staring at each other in silence until food comes, which they eat in silence. My GF at the time and I were on the edge of our seats waiting for something to happen. I once was a server at a very upscale French restaurant in Nick. One evening a middle-aged man and a young woman are sat in my section. Clearly on a date. You could tell this woman was his mistress by the way they interacted with each other. They were high maintenance but pleasant enough. Right after they had received their entrees, the man looks across the way to another table and loses all the color in his face. His date noticed and turned to see what he was looking at. The man's wife was at another table, also on a date with her side piece. On the other side of the restaurant, the wife sees him and has the same expression on her face, which very quickly turns to rage. She briskly walks over to his table and starts whisper yelling at him, pointing her finger right in his face. He starts to do the same back at her. This isn't a very big restaurant. Everyone knows what's going on and the atmosphere gets icy. The man's date is just staring at her plate, absolutely mortified. The wife's date pretends nothing is happening and continues eating. Eventually, the wife storms back over to her table and wolfs down her dinner. No exaggeration. She was like rage eating. He sits down and his mistress won't speak to him for the rest of the meal. This is a fine dining restaurant and they ordered multiple courses. Having to clear, crumb, and reset their table 2 more times was less than fun. He left a very big tip and apologized on the way out. This one is sad. I was managing at the time and had a lady in her mid-40s can me I'm dressed pretty nicely. She was not an ugly woman by any means but she wasn't overly attractive either. She was super excited to be going on a blind date and showed up early. She sat and had a glass of wine and chatted up my bartenders, servers and myself. We all really liked this woman. Super sweet and friendly and seemed to really be trying to have a nice time. Then her date shows up. He comes in about a half hour late and is talking in the phone. Sits next to the woman and continues talking. Finally he gets off the phone and goes over to the bar to get a drink, which is also strange since my server would have done that for him. Proceeds to order a drink from the bar. Drinks it. Orders another drink then sits down. The woman tries to have a conversation with him but he's constantly looking around the room like he was seeing if there was anything better for him to be doing. Finally when my waitress takes their order he asks for his food to go. His food comes out, he grabs it and gets up and leaves. He tries to say something to me about how the woman was not attractive and he had to get out of there. He did it in a way that he tried to get me to agree with him and I just eye-rolled him and walked away. Woman started crying and my entire female staff is over at the table trying to talk to her. I was going to basically let her hang out there all night and get whatever she wanted on the house but she was too upset and left shortly after. That guy was such a douche and she was such a sweetheart. It really angered me how he treated her. I had a teenage couple come accompanied by a parent. I once saw a guy shake his date's hand when she reached over to grab some bread. Tinder date. Guy keeps ordering for the girl. That is weird anyway, but when you are legitimately having dinner with a stranger, why the duck would you think that's okay? He ordered her drink, liquor, which she corrected to a glass of wine. Then he ordered her some soup, which she stated she didn't want. Then he ordered her meal, shrimp scampi, which she corrected to chicken masala because she is allergic to shellfish. She was very sweet and I'm assuming was trying to give him the benefit of the doubt. Until something took a turn and she poured her wine on his head and stormed out. The one good thing about him though, he tipped the hell out of me, like almost 60 and number 37. Tip on an already expensive meal. I would kill to find out what he said to make this seemingly sweet girl pour Cabernet all over him. Used to bartend waitress at a pub back in the day. One evening a guy comes in and sits down at a table for 2. I go ask him if he want a drink. He orders a drink and tells me that he is waiting for a girl he's meeting for a date to order food. He waits for a bit and I served him a couple drinks. An hour passes. He's looking at his phone occasionally and drinking. He finally comes up to the bar after an hour and a half and tells me he thinks he's been stood up. That's rough, man. He orders a couple drinks neat and pounds them back. He's starting to look and sound considerably worse for wear at this point. He ordered a couple more drinks and I told him to wait a bit. He convinced me to get them for him by telling me he was going to drink them and leave. So he downs the drink and get up to leave. We should walk in the door as he's turning to go. His date. She was still wearing scrubs and looked pretty disheveled. She apologized up one side and down the other for being late. I then got to serve one of the most awkward dates ever. He was drunk. Like I probably shouldn't have gave him that last drink drunk. They make some small talk and it's terribly awkward. He gets up and goes to the bathroom. 20 minutes go by and he doesn't come back. Finally one of the male servers walk up and tells her that her date is having some troubles in the bathroom. He was sitting on the toilet bawling. We asked her to get him out of there. We called him a cab and she pretty much shoved him into it and ran. To preface, I work at a restaurant where we make our own ketchup and some people just don't like it. Fine. Whatever. If you're nice I'll bring you the secret Heinz ketchup as long as you don't tell anyone. Anyway, a woman is seated at my table looking super excited and tells me she's on a blind date. She orders a glass of wine and waits anxiously. How cute, right? So this dude shows up on his phone, ignores my hostess, and eventually finds this beautiful woman waiting for him. He continued to talk on his phone for like 15 minutes. And when he finally hung up I went to the table. He tried to order for her which obviously embarrassed her, and for himself ordered a well done steak and fries. When I brought it to him he asked for A1 and real ketchup. When I informed him we had neither he grunted and said he had ketchup packets in his truck. As soon as he walked out the door she asked for her half of the check and her food to go. I helped her leave out the side door before he could even come back. It was awkward serving him after that. He used 7 ketchup packets. Not a date but the end result was the guy paying for the girl's meal and drinks. Very chatty woman in her early 20s was at the bar and ordering more than a few drinks. Probably 5 or 6 cocktails and a few beers. Did I mention this was the middle of the day? Guy sits next to her and they end up chatting. Good for them. It's time for her to leave and she hands me a credit card which is of course declined. She apologizes and fishes around for another credit card. This one is declined as well. She gets a little pouty and plays the woe is me card. White knight next to her swoops in and says not to worry, he'll pay the bill, which is around $100. I guess he was expecting to get some and take her home, but as soon as he paid and the card went through she fast walked out of the place and was never seen again. The couple broke up. He dumped her toward the beginning. Girl cried while giving her order. They finished their whole meal, dessert and all. Edit. I didn't expect this to get so much attention. Thanks all. My first day at my first job as a server at a sushi restaurant. 17 at the time with minimal people skills lol. I had just checked in an older woman possibly in her early 60s late 50s with a young man who couldn't have been older than 25. Midway through their meal I went to check up on them asking, are you taking mom out today? They both turned with straight faces and the young man answered, she's my girlfriend. I whispered an apology and just peeled myself away. Probably the one where the guy's choice of footwear was such a turnoff that the woman didn't even sit down with him. She left before he even saw that she came in. I was a hostess at the time so I had to go awkwardly explain to the gentleman that his date arrived and left. When he asked if she gave a reason, I had to tell him that she didn't like his shoes. His choice of footwear? Those strange running shoes that look like feet. The ones where each individual toe goes into a separate spot like toe socks. Luckily they were black and grey and not any sort of crazy colors. He wore them with a nice grey suit. It was really bad looking. Man was devastated. Note, this was almost 7 years ago. Long before they were popular. We had a middle-aged lady come in with a gentleman. They asked for 3 menus. I went over to the table to introduce myself and ask if they were waiting for one more. The woman said no, her husband is here, and then the 2 physically at the table ordered drinks and a water. When I came back to drop off the drinks her date was in the bathroom. The lady explained to me that her husband had died a few years ago and this guy, a friend, kept asking to go out. So she said yes but insisted her dead husband come with them. This is why they had 3 menus. She instructed me to bring her husband up as often as possible. Pretend that I knew him and make sure I ask if he's having anything for dinner when I took their dinner order. She would refer to him just as if he was sitting right there. I then heard her tell this guy all night that he tries too hard and he's kind of mean. I do not miss working in the restaurant industry. It was clearly a blind date. Neither were comfortable at all. Dropped off drinks. Both were polite. Dropped off food. Asked how everything was. The guy rolled his eyes and said, well, the food is great, I just wish she would talk more. Girl's face went tomato red and I dropped off the check shortly after. Poor girl. I was not a server at the time but OS. My boyfriend and I went out to dinner one night and sitting directly in front of us was a middle-aged man wearing basketball shorts, a t-shirt and flip-flops with socks. He had ordered himself a large appetizer and was drinking a beer. 5 minutes later, this younger, attractive, very nicely dressed woman came in and sat with him. You could tell by the look on her face that this was a first date and not what she expected. By this time, he had already ate most of the appetizer and was very loudly talking about how tiny her body was and how he's a big man that likes to be in charge. We felt terrible for this girl. She was very mousy and seemed too sweet to say anything. He kept trying to get her to take shots with him and then was commenting about her having to crash at his place. It was time to leave, so we made the bartender aware that the girl looked to be uncomfortable. Watching an older gentleman on a blind date get knocked out of his chair when he started having a heart attack. He had a built-in defibrillator and I guess that's what caused him to get knocked out of his seat. Okay, walk into work at 5 PM. The only people in the bar were a couple on a date. A fellow bartender walks out of the restroom shaking his head in disbelief and shock. He immediately starts pointing to the guy and told me what happened. I walk into the men's restroom and before my precious eyes lays a Havana omelette, fesses, on the floor and it's smeared all over the restroom wall like a ducking mosaic. I'm so livid and dry heaving at this point that a waitress asked if she could say something to the gentleman. I said sure, and she walked up to the table and asked the guy if he hit himself and if he needs a doctor. The woman on the date then turns around to look at the waitress in complete confusion and asked what the waitress said. The waitress then replied, he knows what I'm talking about. He shat all over the men's. The woman on the date shoved her plate and drink into the guy's lap and said, really Vince? Again? He ran out so fast before we could make him clean it. Couple in their 50s came in. Husband asked if anyone spoke Mandarin. Chinese restaurant. I brought out the owner. Turns out, they are married. The wife just arrived from China. She doesn't speak any English. The husband didn't speak and Mandarin. The owner ended up sitting with them for a half hour translating. Wasn't serving at this time, but oversaw this waiting for takeout at a sushi place. Around 3ish, a guy comes in and explains to the staff that he was coming in later that night with a date, and that he wants them to come out with a roll and say hi so and so. Nice to see you again. This is on the house. The waitress gave him the most blank look, so he explained the whole thing again, emphasizing how he would actually pay for the roll now. I should have gone back later to see how that played out. I waited tables during college. The most awkward date I saw unfold at that time was a lady in her mid-30s who got stood up. Like an hour in, she was still waiting and drinking her 3rd glass of wine. It was really sad to see her come to the realization that her date stood her up, but by that time, she had 3 glasses of wine in her and she ordered food and just talked with random wait staff from time to time, and I'm fairly certain ended up convincing one of the waiter who was getting off his shift to go home with her. Not a server, but my so and I went to a hibachi restaurant and witnessed the most cringe-worthy moment. We sit down at our table and are joined by another couple. We say hello and casually chit-chat with the strangers. Just before the chef begins to cook, the woman hands her boyfriend a small gift bag. The guy opens the bag and finds a card with an ultrasound pic inside. The man is visibly upset and embarrassed, telling her that she knows he doesn't want any kids. A hushed argument ensues and the woman disappears into the bathroom. He then tells us that he doesn't even like this woman and really doesn't want a kid with her. We finished our meals in awkward silence and often wonder what happened to those people. A pair in their mid-20s on what appeared to be a first date where the girl was clearly way out of the guy's league and he was apparently completely broke. I mean, like trying to make it work on literal pocket change broke. Every time she tried to order something he was like, no. Do you guys have anything cheaper? At one point he had a pile of change on the table and they were counting it out together. Lol. They ended up getting water and an order of french fries that they shared. She looked horrified, but to her credit she stuck it out for the duration. Felt bad for the guy, but at the same time I just have no idea what he was thinking. And no. For the record, it was not Dave Chappelle. This guy waited for his fiancée to show up only to get on his knees and propose pretty much the moment she sat down. I immediately knew from the look on her face that things were going to go downhill real quick. I was working at Olive Garden at the time, so they ordered some pasta. Everyone could hear them arguing, but mostly you could hear the woman repeatedly say, "You know how I ducking feel about him." The fight continued until I heard a loud "oh." She threw an entire plate of pasta at his face. She stormed outside. He followed and eventually the cops came and arrested the woman. I assume she was arrested for aggravated assault or something. Edit. She went outside first. Edit 2. Highest voted comment, haha. Woo. I am a friend of a server who told me that the worst date she witnessed was one night with a 50-year-old man and an early 20s woman. All of the booths were filled, so they were seated at a table for two. But the woman sat in the guy's lap the whole time. In his lap. WTF. So their plates were pushed side by side awkwardly and half of the table was not used. And to top it all off, they dined and dashed. Cheap horny weirdos. I once had a couple on a date who were regulars. They shared a bottle of wine and were having a great time. About 45 minutes into their meal, the table across from them was seated with a large party. On my way to check on the couple, one of the people in the large party pulls me aside and asks me what their co-worker Paul is doing with that young lady. I told them that he was on a date and that they've been there a few times together. The gentleman looks at me in disbelief and says, "I just had lunch with him and his wife, Carol, earlier this week," and proceeds to point Paul out to the rest of the group who were all familiar with Paul and Carol. Paul was not with Carol that night. Edit. Wording. Not a server, but I was at an outdoor restaurant bar and it must have been their first date or something. But a couple was sitting across from each other and the girl was endlessly texting while the guy was talking to her. He just kept talking, laughing, and she kept saying yeah, cool, nice. She wouldn't even look up from her phone for a straight 30 minutes. I would have gone to the bathroom and never come back if I were him. At a table, girl showed up first and then the man. She was super quiet and so was he, until like 30 minutes and he's screaming at her and she goes to the bathroom. My table next to them was shocked and he said, "What the hell are you looking at? You think I'm gonna beat her? I'm not gonna ducking beat her." After they said nothing to him at all, they obviously broke up during the meal and I told two off-duty bouncers what was happening. The girls at the table next to them didn't say anything until the breakup couple left, and they found the girl leaving the bathroom and said they'd walk her home. Not to worry about the tab, etc. So she leaves with them and the guy says nothing about the event. Nothing. Asks for their check. Leaves me almost 100%. Leaves. Then the girls next to them speak up about it to me. And they're young college girls, so I had to explain to them if they ever see this going on or it's happening to them to let their server know or another server discreetly and we'll make sure they get a ride walk home. They were totally shocked restaurant staff would do that for them. I hope they told their friends they could use that, too. Wasn't so much date. Despite her trying pretty hard, I was eating at a pub with my parents Christmas Eve near my work when we see a work function nearby getting really rowdy. There's this woman, probably mid-40s, trying very hard to look mid-20s, and aging herself even more, hitting on her co-worker pretty heavily. He seems really uncomfortable about the whole thing and frequently tried to get her out of his hair by moving seats around the table to talk to other co-workers. She keeps following. We're finishing up our food when he gets up to leave, saying bye to everyone and that his ride is there. We watch her follow him out where he is meeting up with this handsome guy, whom he kisses and turns to introduce her to his husband, which we gathered by him pointing to the rings on their fingers. Looked hella awkward for her. I worked at a semi-casual restaurant and we would have a decent amount of blind dates. So I have a gentleman arrive for his reservation. So I seat him at table 8. Then I have a lady show up. Looking for her friend, I ask her if it's the gentleman at table 8. She thanks me and sits down with him. Well, they start hitting it off great. Order drinks, apps, the whole thing. Then, another guy comes in. Says he is waiting for his friend and stands in the lobby texting on his phone. Eventually we catch on that he was also on a blind date and was supposed to be with the girl at table 8. The girl eventually comes up after getting a text from him. Apologized, then sat down with both guys to enjoy the apps. Well, eventually she suggests that her date was with the second guy and that the first guy should head out. But it turns out the first guy was stood up on his blind date. Lol, it was such a mess. And the first guy was royally pissed that he was being kicked away. Hope that made sense. Y2K. We had to update everything manually. This wasn't exactly a date, but one of the most awkward situations I've seen. I used to bartend and run cold side at a pretty fancy Cajun place in my hometown. One night I was fixing some salads while my co-worker was bartending. An older couple sits down at the bar and places their drink and appetizer order. Nothing out of the ordinary. 10 or 15 minutes pass and in walks one of my brother's friends that I recognize, and she sits down in between the couple who were her parents. Anyway, they continue to act completely normal and we're actually quite a joy to have sitting at the bar. But something happened when I left to grab their appetizer from the kitchen. When I come back, the gentleman is laying into his wife about this, that and the other. I try really hard to tune out other people's conversations while bartending. It's none of my business. The only words I really caught were ungrateful and you should be ashamed. Now mind you, this couple had only had 2 drinks at this point and seemed completely sober when they walked in, so alcohol didn't play a part. I felt so sorry for their daughter. She looked mortified sitting in between them and just kept sipping her drink while occasionally begging for them to stop fighting. The couple ended up leaving separately, and their daughter stayed behind and looked so broken. I felt terrible for her as I come from a broken home. So I went over and introduced myself and said how I recognized her from my brother's friend group and bought her a drink. Super nice girl. It's a shame she had to endure that mess in public. I worked at a nice Italian restaurant in university, and one day a nice man came in to make a reservation and explained he was going to propose. So he wanted a certain table and wanted to mirror other things that had happened from their first date. It was really sweet. He seemed so in love and nice, and we were all quite excited for him. When they came in, she was appropriately excited and impressed with the table and remembered their date, and things were going well from a distance. We finally get to the big moment. The ring was in her champagne, and they just go hushed tones and quiet. It was a slow night. We were all watching. The hostess had been asked to take pictures to send to him. Next, the guy gets up, won't even look at her and leaves, and she just puts her head down and cries. She said no. She didn't tell us why, but she seemed quite distraught. We all ended up consoling her, weirdly enough. Just happened about an hour ago. Pre-prom dinner or something. Guess they had taken pictures today so not to have to do it tomorrow. Guys and girls all done up. Suits, sparkly dresses. One girl got up to use the bathroom. Guess she didn't know it was that time of month. Her dress had a huge spot on the back. She had absolutely no clue. Female server runs in after her to tell her. They explain this to her date. He says, guess there goes my night and weekend, and just nope the fuck out the restaurant. Left her here and with the bill. I'm not a server, but I used to work as a bakery clerk. The bakery was attached to a restaurant. I had to go inside the restaurant and pass out samples, and I witnessed a table where the guy was on his phone the entire time. It didn't seem too bad until they came to the bakery afterwards and ordered cake slices. I asked them if they wanted their cake slices in the same box or separate, and the woman said same box, and her boyfriend interrupted saying no, separate boxes. It didn't seem like a big deal, but this woman ducking lost it. She started listing off everything he did wrong and how he's probably cheating on her with his ex. It was absolutely glorious, and I got to stand there for 10 minutes and watch it happen. Edit. For those of you asking for the list of things this guy did wrong according to the girl, this is how I remember it as. 1. He didn't pay for her meal. 2. He didn't share his fries. I can see why she's mad at him for this. 3. He ignored her for a majority of the date. 4. He didn't compliment her outfit or makeup. 5. He used his vape in the restaurant. These were the main points of her argument. There was a lot more to the list, but it was hard to understand what the girl was saying towards the end because she started crying. I work at an ice cream parlor. A couple years ago I had a couple come in. It seemed like their first or at least one of their first dates. Kind of nervous around each other, but they seem to go together well. They're looking over the menu and they finally decide or whatever. They're standing at the register and the girl takes out her wallet to get ready to order hers. He insists he'll pay and they spend a minute or two going back and forth over this while I wait for them to order. They come to an agreement that he will pay. Thank goodness. It's always awkward standing there while people argue over this and both shove their credit cards at you and expect you to choose who is responsible for the bill. They order. I go get their sundaes, ring them up, and once this guy sees the total, which was probably like $10 or less, he awkwardly stands there for a minute and says to me, "Can we do them separate?" Then turns to the girl and says, "You still wanted to pay for your own, right?" She looks kind of like, TF, and slowly gets her wallet back out of her bag that she'd put away when he decided he would pay and was like, "Yeah, sure, that's fine." They sat inside in mostly silence for like 15 minutes and she clearly was no longer interested. Lumfeo. I didn't know who to feel bad for. I'm all for splitting the bill. I would never expect a dude to pay for me just because I'm a woman. But after the few minutes they spent debating and he insisted, and then instantly changed his mind because his date was not worth $5. That was an awkward one, especially because that couple and Emmy were the only people in the shop the whole time. When I worked at a drive-through coffee shop, my team and I saw this super awkward teenage couple on their first date. We were right by a high school and movie theater, so it wasn't anything unusual. However, as he got ready to back mom's minivan out of a parking spot, the poor kid hit the gas pedal by mistake. Car goes straight into the marsh behind our parking lot. Police, fire department, and mom show up a bit later to pick up the kid. Everyone was fine. Just one case of severely wounded pride. Another one that started out awful but ended wonderful. Two teenage to early 20s girls came in for a date. I don't know how this happened, but one poor girl was a little too excited to use the revolving door. Moves faster than the door can turn. And smacks her head on the glass. Looked like it hurt. She immediately starts bawling, so I rush over with a rag filled with ice. She's got a bump on her forehead and a small cut but was okay. At one point she looked up to the ceiling and cried. This is so embarrassing. My co-workers and I gave them free coffee and all the pastries they wanted to eat. Both girls ended up staying until close, talking and left holding hands. I hope they are still happy.